Okay, so let's go to the next talk and welcome Marco Slaviero and Azhar Desai. They will talk about sock puppetry, and I won't say more because I saw they have 211 slides, so just hurry up, please.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Don't worry, mostly they're pictures of cats, so we'll go through them pretty quickly. So there's three of us from Thinkst. You heard from Harun yesterday. He also worked with us on this, but Azhar and I are going to be presenting this stuff. So our talk is on sock puppetry. Both Azhar and Harun have shaved since we took those photos, but mostly we work at Thinkst, and we try to work on what we consider to be interesting problems. So there's a guy called Tim Wu, and we need to start just with a bit of a broader look. Tim Wu is a guy who invented the term network neutrality at that point, or net neutrality, over 10 years ago. He's a lawyer in America. He writes about the intersection of technology and the law. And in 2010, he wrote this book called The Master Switch. And The Master Switch was a historical look at how many types of technologies, after they've been invented, at some point they start open and they are in support of freedom and exchange of information. And over time, those technologies become closed. And the basic examples there are TV, radio, and the old one is the telephone. And sort of with this progression, the question is, well, what's going to happen now with the internet, right? So this is also a new technology, and has this thing sort of migrated into the internet space? And we've seen some examples of this. So in 2011, with the whole Arab Spring movement in Egypt and in Libya, both of those countries cut access completely to the internet when their citizens started talking about things they didn't like. Even last year in Turkey, there was the blockage of YouTube when a video was published that was unfavorable towards the government. And so this stuff is happening. But in truth, ultimately, amateurs cut access, right? To just have such a blunt sword that blocks people from saying the things that they think they want to say is immediately visible, and people know what it is that you're doing. And so there's alternative ways to do this. Also in 2011, Tunisia took a slightly different approach. They left access in place, but they started fiddling with the access. So what they were doing was collecting credentials in Gmail, Facebook, Yahoo, and so on. And so they would harvest credentials and from that use that to target specific people, but they didn't simply just cut internet access, which sort of made a lot more news. But it's not just in the Arab Spring. It's not just in far-flung countries. Also in 2011, in the London riots, the technology used there was smartphones, and it was used to track and arrest rioters. So the technology that was open can also be used for persecution. And so we have this idea that that's all old technology. The internet is different. Like, what we know about the internet, or what we think we know about the internet, is that it's designed to root around problems. We'll leave the nuclear thing aside, but we think that the internet can root around issues. And so when it comes to censorship, we're just going to root around censorship. And so even when governments put methods in place to try and control what people are saying, they will root around it. And one of the ways that if you talk to people, they'll suggest it gets rooted around is through user-generated content, UGC. And so the idea there is that when governments try and control a news flow, people can retweet someone's views on the ground, people can follow on social media, and they don't accept the official view, they can see their own. And so one of the, for me, one of the funny examples of this was the Russian soldier who posted stuff on social media sites in the Ukraine, which had like his geolocation in the Ukraine. So you had an official story coming out of Russian media, and there was a guy posting pics on Twitter that put him in the Ukraine. So it is kind of a newish paradigm, not completely, but this idea of democratized content is something which we're still trying to deal with. We're still trying to understand. And so if we look at it in terms of censorship, the question then becomes, well, how is it going to be handled? How do people who want to control what others are saying, reading, hearing, and discussing, how will they behave in this world of UGC? And so to look at that, let's take a step back. Because when it comes to control, the techniques are well worn, and there's nothing really that new under the sun. Control is not a new, it's not a new idea at all. And so if we frame this in terms of the 60s in the US, where there was a sort of a movement against the Vietnam War and other aspects, but the student movement in the US, one of the ways that they were controlled was direct force, but when that became, like it's pretty blatant when people are getting clubbed on the head in the newspapers, you can then start to change the way that those crowds are perceived by having other people there both opposing them or acting with them, apparently, but at the same time dragging their cause through the mud. So this idea of rent-a-crowds is one which is well-worn, and it's a common technique for control. So if we return to that question about how censorship will be handled in the age of user-generated content, we can look to one of our industry or movement even well-known folks. So Aaron Schwartz, when he was still with us, he wrote in The Internet's Own Boy that it's not only how certain people have a license to speak, now everyone has a license to speak. It's a question of who gets heard. So everyone can speak with UGC, but if you can control who hears what is being said, then you can control the effect of user-generated content. So it means what we're worried about, to put it lamely, is censorship 2.0. So in this world of UGC, how is censorship then handled? And we think this is a profoundly important topic, which is why we spend some time on it. And we spend some time on this with the assistance of the Open Technology Fund. One of the reasons why we think this is so bad is because with Tum Wu's ideas of the master switch, it really does have the potential to influence much control. And this particular kind of hack is really a hack against the human mind. So, rent-a-crowds, but in the age of the internet and in the age of UGC, what would those look like? And with not too much thought, you arrive at the notion of sock puppets. And sock puppets are, if you're not aware of the definition, this is one definition of a sock puppet. But in essence, it's just online identities under the control of alternative or third parties, and they're used to push certain viewpoints. And they can simply be individual identities or alternative identities or entire coordinated mass movements or armies of sock puppets. So we wanted to ask ourselves, when we started with this work, if we were some kind of evil corporation or government, how would we go about this, right? So if we're trying to understand how it might be happening, we need to understand how we would do it. And so we had three questions that we wanted to ask ourselves. So what can be done, what will be done, and what is being done? And that last one is particularly important as we see it. But in essence, the core of this work is we're going to look at a bunch of different methods of publishing UGC, and what we're trying to see is how can we get more people to pay attention to what we're saying, or alternatively, how can we decrease the importance of something that we don't like? How can we make sure that other people are less likely to see it? So there are two approaches, and we try both of those. Increase the attention on something that we like, decrease the attention on something that we don't like. And very quickly, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why you don't see too much work in this area, the problem you get is how do you measure efficacy? How do you know if you're actually making a difference in terms of increasing attention or decreasing attention? Because there is so much content out there, and it's really hard to say, well, we did these things, so clearly, and people were talking about what we wanted to promote, or we tried to decrease the attention on this thing and fewer people were talking about it. We must, does that mean we succeeded? Maybe it's a Sunday night and people aren't paying attention, or maybe there happened to be a public holiday or an election somewhere else. So those sorts of correlations are quite tricky to have. So we thought we'd focus on, at least in trying to measure if we have an effect, we thought we'd focus on 5 main areas here. So mail list, polls, Reddit, news sites, and comment systems. Follow along, like there's some fun stuff in here, and if you're online in the last year, you might have bumped into some of what we did. You just weren't aware of it. So Azhar will take us from mailing list.
So I'm sure some of you may be asking yourselves, well, why mailing list? And there's really two reasons for us. There's really two reasons why we wanted to focus on mailing list. The first is that there's still interesting people using mailing lists. There are many activist mailing lists. There are, of course, many cool InfoSec mailing lists. And there are, of course, our favorite standards mailing list, where people debate what sort of standard we should be using. And then the second reason is mainly just personal curiosity. Mailing lists are really simple. They're just emails go into a mailing list. They get bounced around to everyone else. Is there really space to play around and see what we can do and make more or less people see things or not see things we don't want them to do? So eventually what we wanted to do here is send an email to a mailing list and, as Marco mentioned, make more people see it or make less people see it. And in order to do that, we need to find a way to measure how many people are actually reading our email. So we take an approximate measure. We just embed link clicks in the email, and we use that as some sort of rough idea of how many people are reading our emails. The second question when it comes where we have to answer when sending emails is that what should we put in these emails? Typically, being the lazy guys we are, what we just did is steal content from everywhere else. Copy them from other emails, copy them from other blog posts, copy them from wherever, and put them in. But making sure not to make them too exciting and trying to give the emails roughly equal appeal. So in our first experiment, what we wanted to do is take a look and see, can we get more people to read an email? So what we did here is we'd send an email and do nothing else, and just get a sense of how many clicks does a normal email get when we do nothing. And then the second time around, we'd send an email, but this time we have a whole lot of our own SockPuppet email accounts waiting on the side. And when that email comes in, we follow it up by sending a whole lot of extra emails to make a long fake discussion thread on our email. So it's really simple, and then in the mailing list archive, you'll see something like this. So there's an initial email followed up by a fake conversation that we've created. And the results of this was actually interesting. So we repeated this experiment several times on two mailing lists, Liberation Tech and Full Disclosure. And blue is the sort of baseline or control email. That's a typical sort of number of clicks you're going to get. And then the green bars are the clicks that our emails get when we follow it up with a fake discussion thread. So in general, when you do this, the fake discussion thread tends to draw more attention to the things you send through. The second experiment we want to try is, okay, which seems like we can get more people to see email, but can we get less people to see stuff we don't want to see? Maybe someone sent a really good idea about a really good pseudo-random number generator, and we just can't have that going on in our crypto standard. So we'll do a different experiment. Again, we first send a test email with a baseline to get a baseline feel for how many clicks happen. And then this time, we send the email, but we follow it up with a flood of new emails that start a whole lot of new threads, and we see, can we drown out the attention that this email, that the initial email gets? So it'll look something like that. And the effect this time is the reverse. So generally what will happen is you'll send the email, and the email that was followed up with a whole lot of extra threads would tend to get less attention, presumably because people are sort of wading through all the other emails that you sent. But one really cool thing happened during while we were running this experiment. So Marco promised you a picture of a cat, so we'll bring that up now. But one of the SockPuppet email accounts we had was named after a cat, and it essentially just sent an email to Full Disclosure, which was copy and pasted from a paste and paste. And what ended up happening was 3 days later, this same account was cited in a vulnerability database as a security researcher. So, which is useful to note. It may be a little bit funny that a cat becomes a security researcher in 3 days, but it is pretty useful to note that when people are busy echoing whatever it is that you say, it's useful when you're trying to build up a more real-world, believable personas. One last point on mailing lists is that, so we have these two things that we can do. We can draw attention to an email, and we can distract attention with email. There's a more effective thing we can do, which is to combine those two together. So, and into an improved way to distract attention from something. So we see an email that we don't like, and then our immediate usual response is to follow up with a whole lot of extra emails to try and down our attention. But this time, instead of just sending those emails, we also add fake discussions on top of those emails in order to improve the amount of distraction that we get. And the nice thing is also that you can prepare your juicy distraction threads ahead of time, whatever editor flame wars or whatever you wish to bring up. and that'll work best as a distraction. So that's mailing lists. Generally, we've seen now that we can sort of pull attention off, pull eyeballs off emails, and push eyeballs onto emails that we want to see. The next thing we'll take a quick look at is online polls. So the reason why we take a look at online polls is that they're still used by a few major news sites such as the Huffington Post, Al Jazeera, and of course many random bloggers across the internet. The useful thing about polls is that people see the results of them. So that's just what we try to manipulate. And naturally, this is a very, very, very ancient tradition. People have been manipulating polls since a very long time ago. One of the funniest examples we were looking at was a 1998 example for when the People magazine had a most beautiful person poll. And Leonardo da Vinci, when he was in his prime, his Titanic prime, got 14,000 votes. But the entertainer, Hank the Angry Drunk Giraffe, got 230,000 votes. Another obvious funny example is just 2009 when Moot, the founder of 4chan, was voted to be the world's most influential person. And of course, I can't mention this without saying they also spelled marble cake, also the game, in the results. So surely you'd expect this to be a solved problem. You know, maybe there's just a trade-off between the difficulty to sign up versus the amount of participation you get, but doesn't quite seem so. So what we thought we'd do is just take a quick look at one or two and do two things. Pick an option in a poll and make that option win, but by an obviously large landslide margin, or do it more subtly and make it win by a small margin. So one commonly used poll service is Poll Daddy. We won't really talk about it just because it's owned by every single body and everybody and possibly their cat as well. So we can look it up. But we should mention the Huffington Post Readers Poll. So that's the green bar. Now, this is an exceptionally trivial poll, in which votes are simply just a single HTTP request from a single IP. So really, there's really nothing to this. You can sit at home and do this from your DSL connection. So we just take a poll like this, and you can see they're not closely at all. The readers poll is the green bar. That's at 5%. We can push it up to win by a sort of smaller, to be the leading option by a small margin, and then we can just push it up to win completely outright. So in general, polls have a pretty serious credibility problem. So that's polls. I mean, we can definitely play around them and manipulate some of the results. The next one I want to take a look at is Reddit. So I know from some of the discussions at one of the dinners, I know there's some Redditors, there may be some Redditors in the crowd. So you may already know how it works, but for the rest of us, let's just take a quick walk through what Reddit is. So it's just essentially a site for posting links and contents and having users rank them by voting them, commenting on them, and the most popular post will appear more prominently. So Reddit is divided into a whole lot of sub-communities called subreddits, and they generally focus on a particular topic or meme or something, and they range from the totally silly, like pictures of birds with arms, to the more serious world news where people come to figure out what's going on in the world today. So when we take a look at a subreddit, the default ordering that you see is something called the hot scoring, and that's one we're going to focus on. So there are two factors involved in this particular scoring. The one is the number of votes an item gets, so that's the total upvotes minus total downvotes, and the age of articles. So new articles are naturally a lot more prominent. And what we want to do here is a very similar thing to what we've been trying to do with mailing lists and we've been trying to do with polls. We want to take things that we want to promote. We want to have things that we want to promote, and we'll do this by upvoting and try and get as many people to see it as possible. And we'll have topics that we just want to hide or bury and want people not to see them at all, and we'll do that with downvoting. But before we can begin to play on Reddit, we'll need some accounts. So you can sit down easily and using some open web proxies and maybe solving the captures manually yourself, and in a day's work, you create 100 or so accounts. So we created a few accounts, and initially in our first testing, our accounts seemed broken. They didn't seem to be having the effect that we wanted when we were voting with them. So the interesting thing here is that Reddit is clearly aware, or is clearly trying to stop people gaming it, and one of the things they do is they try to hide the effects of your initial votes from you. So they'll have things like vote fuzzing, where they don't show the actual vote scores, but they show a score that's near the true score. So when you actually vote, you don't know whether your vote has actually had an effect, so they can silently discard it and prevent you quickly learning how to make your bots better. But it turns out that wasn't so much of a problem for us. We just took all our 50 accounts and said, okay, well, let's use them and then see does it have the larger effect that we're looking for. So on small accounts, on small subreddits, it's pretty easy to get an article up onto the front page just by posting a new one and upvoting it. So on NetSec, which is a InfoSec subreddit, we could easily get an article up because there's not that many subscribers and not that many people voting, so the numbers are quite a bit smaller. But on a large subreddit like World News, 50 isn't enough for full wins. You'd have some small effect, but it really isn't enough to make the front page just because there are a lot more people involved. I mean, World News typically has around 6 million subscribers, so our 50 bots are pretty much a drop in the ocean. But on the other side of the spectrum, you want to try downvoting. So there's a number of interesting things that can happen when you downvote besides just lowering the score. The first two interesting stuff that are quite useful if you're trying to completely remove an item from view. So the one option is that some subreddits are configured in a little bit more cautious way, and that if an article immediately tracks a few downvotes, that article is shunted completely off the page and into a moderation queue, where the subreddit moderator has to approve it manually before it's visible again. It's pretty useful if you just want to get an article quickly hidden. Another nice option is that there's a user subreddit preference where it says, don't show me any articles with a score below a certain point. And if your votes knock that article below that score, that user will never see the article that you downvoted, and they will never know that they never saw the article. So it's quite useful for this sort of thing. The one other sort of downvoting that we were doing was something called trickle downvoting. I'll explain in a minute why we had to do slightly more not straightforward downvoting. But essentially, a more subtle version of downvoting that we were doing was we'd take an article and look at the number of upvotes it had and just downvote without as many upvotes it had. So what was nice about this is that we could take a subreddit, upvote our target post that we'd really like to promote, and continually trickle downvote the others. And we'd have some progress in promoting what we want people to see. So now going back to the mass downvoting. So there's a reason why we had to talk about that trickle downvoting was because initially we asked the obvious question, well, why don't we just take all the bots we've created and just have them downvote all the new posts that come onto the subreddit? Something that it seems that people should have already done and people should have clearly be expecting. So we began with World News, and we just set the bots going, and almost immediately people start to notice that all the new posts have suddenly attracted a whole lot of downvotes. But then this experiment ran a little bit more wilder than we could have anticipated, and all of a sudden their post appeared saying, "Hold on, world subreddit is under attack. Everyone, stay calm. You're not going to lose your karma points. Let's keep posting. Let's keep things going." And the World News moderators published a post where they said, "Okay, guys, this is what's happening. We're cutting an attack." And that post eventually got around 2,000 comments and eventually got promoted all the way to the top, to the front page of the entire Reddit site. So it caused a little bit of a stir. The interesting thing about this post that they posted was that it's a whole lot of words, but what is quite clear from it is that the moderators, A, can't see much about what's going on, so they don't really have much visibility on what we're doing, and B, even if they did, they don't actually have any power to do anything. So in order to get anything actually done on the site, they need to start roping some of the actual site admins. But anyway, while that was all happening behind the scenes, the users on that post were automatically speculating, who is this, what is going on, who could possibly be doing these disastrous things. And some of the funny accusations were that this must have been Putin bot. Someone once reckoned that only all the posts have been downvoted except for the pro-Russian post, which was obviously not happening. We were just downvoting everything. And another accusation was it was the lizard people, which I assume was not intended to be taken seriously. But for the record, we should point out that there was a number of other downvoting brigades that apparently happened earlier, a few months earlier, and including one that happened on our technology. And we had nothing to do with that because people kept pointing fingers and saying, "Hell no, these must be the same people." And we had no idea who the other guys are. We were just playing around over here. And simultaneously, so we ran the same thing, the same downvoting on a smaller subreddit, NetSec. And the response here was quite different. So the NetSec moderators clearly have some incident response skills, and they clearly realize immediately that, okay, they can't see what's going on, they don't know enough to do anything, and they don't have the powers to do anything, so they roped in the Reddit admins to talk about it on their subreddit. And this was pretty interesting, because the admins were commenting on the site so we could see how their progress was going picking this up. And one of the curious things was that one of the admins posted that they said, okay, we've only seen about 20 bots and we've disabled those. This is very strange. We found this quite strange because we'd thrown at least 50 bots at it. Where are the others? Did they not find them? And the one other funny thing is that they said, we're throwing away the votes, but we can't tell them because that would help the person running these bots, so they just make them a bit more cleverer. But then they go and tell us in the comments anyway. So we sort of knew that some of them were becoming ineffective. So the reason why it surprised us that they only spotted a few of them was this should have been really, really, really easy to spot, right? This was really crude. So we had a whole lot of bots were voting in the same time. They had similar sign-up times, common email domain patterns, common pattern names. The IP addresses were all voting for known open web proxies that you can see on the internet. The user agents were very similar. And quite interestingly, the accounts were sort of one-dimensional. They didn't interact with the rest of the site. They didn't interact with other users. So they should stand out quite a bit. But 2 months later, Reddit changed their site a bit. So they used to show the downloads, and they no longer do it anymore. So this is interesting because you can still downvote articles, but this time users won't see those downvotes. So it doesn't really solve the problem of the downvoting. It just means that users won't see them, so they won't suddenly make a big fuss when they see it happening. So it could be silently happening, but they'd have no indication of it. So we'll return back to that point again later in the talk about how having data available about what's happening helps you able to detect whether something is going on that you should be aware of. But coming back to these should have been very easy to spot. There's one last attribute that we should just talk a little bit more about is the low karma interactors. So often on sites like Reddit and Hacker News, there's some sort of notion of karma, which is effectively points that measure how much you've contributed to the site and how other people have valued your contribution. And it's often spoken about in this mythic way where people say that these points only come as a result of incredible hard work and much thoughtful posting. So we took a quick look at how we could grow personas on another site called Hacker News, just to see, does it really take a lot of hard work? And we had a Hacker News account that we've been running for about 3 years, and posted 23 really, really thoughtful submissions on stuff we thought were really interesting and that the world should really, really appreciate. But clearly they didn't because we only got 99 karma points out of that, right? So this is 3 years of wasted hard work. Instead, what we should have done was play around a bit more. So what we did next was we took a 10-line Python script, and what that did was it just scraped a whole lot of popular links from popular blogs, and if there was new posts, immediately posted them to Hacker News, and the effect was astounding. Over the next 10 months, we grew from 99 karma points to 8,000 karma points. So clearly, our 10-line Python script has much better taste in good quality content than we do. But anyway, so that brings us to the end of Reddit. We've seen quite a bit about how we can there's a number of options for shutting out things that we don't want people to see and promoting things we think that the world should know about. The next thing we want to take a quick look at is news sites. So news sites make an obvious target, right? People come there for the news, and what they see forms the basis of how they make their opinions about what's going on in the world. And we don't have much influence on newspapers' editorial sites, but I find out there are parts of newspaper websites that we can control. So if you take a look at many news sites, they often have a panel such as this, which shows the currently most popular articles on them. And it's, in newspaper terms, it's front page and above the fold, so it's prominent and people automatically see it. The question we ask ourselves is, can we influence this panel? By that we mean, can we get stuff on it, i.e. promote it, or can we get stuff off it, shut them out, and not have people see them? So we started off by taking a quick look at a prominent South African newspaper, and their front panel looks something like this. So it's a most read this current week, a list of most read articles in the current week, and it's the ranking is just page views, but page views are easy. We can control that. We can run wget repeatedly in a loop from one box, and eventually what we end up doing is just spelling puns, P-U-N-S, on the thing, and in doing so just shut off any other articles that wish to make it onto the site. In fact, it stays stuck like that for several days afterwards until the other articles organically got enough clicks to get back on. The next site we took a look at was the Wall Street Journal. So they have a slightly different metric. Theirs is a sort of composite metric of a few different rankings. So they use a mixture of 30% from page views, 20% from Facebook shares, 20% Twitter shares, 20% email shares, and 10% the number of comments that a post gets. So page views, we already know how to do that, right? We did that on the previous site. Twitter shares, perhaps we can do that. We had a couple of Twitter accounts lying around, and perhaps if we can combine that, we can get 50% control over that ranking. The one interesting thing, though, is that with the Twitter share count that the Twitter API tells you about, the count that Twitter keeps of each of the link, of the number of times the link has been shared, is quite easy to bump up. So if you take a single Twitter user and you continuously tweet the same link, that number keeps going up. So you can keep doing that as much as you want, and you'll keep inflating that number. Wall Street Journal will just pull that number, and it won't know anything had happened. So yeah, doing that, over a period of about 7 hours, we could bump an article from completely the bottom all the way to the top, even though we couldn't actually read the article because it's a paywalled article, but we could bump it up anyway. The next site we took a look at was the New York Times. So their panel is most emailed. But unlike the others, before we can play on this one, we need accounts on the New York Times on the New York Times site in order to be able to share the articles. So we took a look at their account creation process, and there wasn't any captures, there weren't any email verification. So obviously, we're able to create a few accounts automatically and see what we can do. And in the end, we ended up creating around 30,000 accounts in order to do the email sharing. And we could bump an article from bottom to fairly close to the top. And the interesting thing about this is that the NYT spends quite a bit on their news gathering apparatus. But for us, hold on, I clicked a bit first. But for us, this was really cheap. I mean, we did that entire share thing for under 50 cents. So it's quite a lot of fun and still fairly easy and cheap to manipulate how articles show up quite prominently on that most popular panel on a lot of websites. So the next thing we'll take a look at is comment systems, and Mark will take us away from there.
Cool. So, it really becomes quite clear as we get to this or get into this that manipulating content is easy. And one of the places that people love to post content on is the comments of all sorts of sites. Disqus is a comment system. It's unlikely you've never come across it. So I guess if you browse without JavaScript, you've probably never seen it, but otherwise everyone would have seen it. The really brief description for Disqus, and the reason people use it, is because you can take 3 lines of JavaScript, embed that in your page, and now you've got an entire comment widget that looks good, is updated constantly, it does live feeds, and so on. So it makes it really easy for content owners and sites to concentrate on what they're good at, which is maybe producing a blog or news of some kind, and then they let Disqus handle the comments. And they're big. By big, I mean sort of billion page views a month kind of big. I think it's 3 million at the time, or 2 million users were signing up a month with them. So Disqus is a big player. They're not the only one, though. There are a few others. But you can see why it's attractive to people. So as I say, it's used by blogs, the Tumblrs, Soccer Mom blogs. But it's also used by a bunch of legitimate news organizations. We did this work last year. At the time, CNN and Al Jazeera were both Disqus users. Bloomberg, NextWeb, and a bunch of others rely on Disqus to handle their comments. And so this is really interesting from a UGC perspective, because when you embed comments on a site, what it means is that you control some of the content, but you don't control the entire message. Lots of the stuff on your page is being produced by someone else. And obviously, that's different from a Twitter feed where someone's Twitter page, it's entirely their own. There is a news story that has some kind of built-in authenticity or trust, but part of it is not theirs. And so I'm going to graphically illustrate this for you. That's a screen capture of an entire story off CNN.com in one long screen cap. We're going to flip that on its side. The red line is where, on the left-hand side, that's where CNN and their editors control the content. The right-hand side is where the internet can put content onto a CNN page. Right? And you can see just visually that split is quite different. Obviously, content further up the page gets more attention, but the reality is that most of that content doesn't come from CNN at all. It comes from the internet. And so when we were looking at Discuss, again, like these are easy problems to at least jump to. The question is, well, we want Discuss users. How easy is it to create Discuss users? And what I'm going to show you with the next couple of slides is that the stuff is trivial. Like, it is, when I say it's trivial, I mean it's trivial. We've got one-line bash scripts that can give you 500 accounts in 20-odd seconds. So these are the scripts. The point here is not to say we can write horrible bash. The point here is that when I say it's a one-line bash script, like, it's genuinely a one-line bash script. And so we've now got a whole bunch of Discuss users that we can use to interact with the site. Right? So this is, so I did this video yesterday. Our other video was with CNN. This is with the Telegraph. What you've got there is a comment on a story of global warming that's got 176 upvotes. And perhaps this is something that we don't want to get prominence. We want to bury this comment. And there's another comment that we want in its place. So one-line bash script, we run it for 13 seconds. We're now going to upvote another comment that perhaps we want to push in its place. This one runs a little bit longer. But we're applying, in this case, 200 votes either way. And then, as you can imagine, we refresh the page. The comment that we originally saw is right at the bottom. Okay? So we've pushed that all the way to the bottom. And now the comment that perhaps we wanted to promote gets inserted at that prominent position. So it is trivial to alter or influence what people are saying on a site like Discuss. They've got issues when it comes to this. So complete control with bash scripts, which seems crazy. Like, where are the protection mechanisms? This is what Discuss does, is they need to provide trusted place, or at least a place where people don't feel like they're getting completely manipulated when they have conversations. So, like, it's completely, part of what has made Discuss grow is the fact that there's so few restrictions. So, like, you can, well, IP or user registration isn't IP limited. You don't have to verify emails. There are some restrictions if you act as a guest, but as soon as you've got a cookie, then you can have 500 or thousands of users acting from the same place. And even if you've got IP restrictions, we know that those can be bypassed with proxy lists, which we did. So Discuss really has serious problems with this, and we're going to look at it. Li-Fi is an alternative commenting system. They provide similar services to Discuss, and as you can imagine, vulnerable to the same attacks. Right? The same kind of things are possible in Li-Fi. So, like, it really is just open. Right? So this is Li-Fi and us just pushing stuff to the top of Li-Fi. That's for promoting content. You can vote stuff down to move it in an ordering. But there's also, with commenting systems, they also often have this notion of flagging content, either as spam or as unsavory content or whatever. And then usually that will remove it completely from view until it enters a moderation queue or something. And that can happen. Discuss and Li-Fi handle that slightly differently. On Discuss, if something gets pushed into moderation and then gets allowed, you can't move it back into the moderation. But Li-Fi has, like, basic bugs. Something can get kicked to the moderation queue, allowed, and you can just flag it again to kick it back into the moderation queue. So they don't have any history there. And then in terms of actual other bugs, so Li-Fi, cross-site request forgery, so they've got that bug. You get a Li-Fi user to hit your website, you can steal his Li-Fi token and then post stuff on his behalf. But what makes those sorts of bugs quite interesting for what we're talking about when it comes to censorship and sock puppets is with a bug like that, you can attract attention for Li-Fi users, have them come to your site, get access to their profiles, and now you can have a sock puppet army which has a history, which you haven't had to worry about building up. So those sorts of bugs seem easily fixable, but their impact when they're not fixed is fairly serious in terms of what we're talking about with building sock puppet armies. And I'm not sure how long that was present in Livefire, but it took us looking at sock puppets to point out that they were CSRFable, which seems a bit strange. So that's us grabbing the token. That's us posting stuff on a user that we hadn't seen. So comment systems, like I've kind of rushed the discuss stuff a little bit because we're going to deal with it some more now, but both discuss and Livefire are pretty rotten when it comes to trusting what you can see. And it's pretty clear that the content that you do see on those sites, well, you would have to be suspicious. So we dealt with comment systems and declare success there. So in terms of the three questions that we asked initially, what can be done, what will be done, and what is being done, the question then moves to, well, what is being done? Can we find sock puppets in the wild? Are people doing this? And like always, we go to history, and there's certainly a bunch of examples of this. The 4chan poll that we mentioned earlier, there's a fairly long history of people manipulating Reddit, also using sock puppets. In the early days of Reddit, the Reddit founders were posting content under fake identities to make it seem like the site had more support than it did. So growth hacking of some kind, if you like. There's a site called Common Dreams, which is perhaps a little bit less known. And basically they had, it was pretty Machiavellian. So they had a guy posting anti-Semitic comments. Turned out that dude was a pro-Israel guy who was essentially trying to make people think that the website was anti-Semitic. And in response, people pulled funding from Common Dreams. And so that's like a straight sock puppet attack through a bunch of accounts pushing a view. But in that instance, and this is why attribution becomes really hard, you can swap what people might be doing. And in this case, he wasn't trying to push a pro view. He was trying to push a view that said people don't actually want to be associated with it. So those are the two things that we're quite aware of with sock puppetry. It's easy to promote stuff, but there's also the approaches for removing attention. Again, and this isn't to pick on the Israelis, but this is, we spoke about stuff getting flagged, and this one is just too good to miss. So this is from the IDF Twitter feed, and they're basically saying, like, if you don't like stuff, flag it as spam. Not, like, don't flag spam as spam. If you don't like a comment, then flag it as spam, because that just removes it from view. So those techniques are fairly common, and, or at least are understood. In the Snowden docs, there was mention of the JTRIG group out of the UK, so sort of GCHQ crowd. And according to the docs, they are actively manipulating online polls. So this stuff is happening. So when we thought we were going to go look for it, the one place, given what we'd seen, is that Discuss, which we had played with quite a bit to that point, really seemed to be ripe for picking. So we went there to see if we could find armies. And the initial evidence, or our initial searching seemed promising, right? So at the time, CNN's most commented story, this was the highest ranked comment on their most commented story. And what you can see, it's nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense, right? What this suggests to us is that people are completely gaming the system. And CNN was an interesting example, right? So there's 600 guest votes. And 46,000 comments on a story. So our approach when it came to trying to hunt down the sock puppet armies, or at least to detect if they were there, was, well, let's take a controversial topic. Yep, that's pretty controversial. That'll do. We then thought we need to find a news organization that's going to cover this topic. And those guys cover it in a lot of detail. And then what we would do is go to Al Jazeera's, well, we can use the Discuss API. They've got a really nice API. We can pull a list of all the popular stories from the Discuss API, but that were written on Al Jazeera. And then for each story, we pull user info for the users who commented on those stories. And then we want to try and see what stories do users comment on. And we put that into a big graph because big data, and what we get is a scatter plot that actually we can't do anything with. Like, we thought we'd get magic stuff just appear out of this, and it never appeared out of that. So we tried a few things to, or a few different ways to cut and slice that particular data. and then took a step back and said, actually, comments on stories are one way to add your voice to something, but the other way to affect, actually the thing that we're looking at is trying to impact whether or not people are seeing things. Not, if we remember that everyone has a voice, the question is who gets to be heard. Commenting is just the voice. Everyone has that. Who gets to be heard is actually voting. It's not commenting. And so we decided to start looking at voting patterns, not on commenting patterns. And so we then essentially pull voting patterns. And the metric that we used in this particular instance was the age of the voter who commented on, or the age of a voter who voted on a given comment. So we would take all the top stories. For every story, we pulled down all the comments that were placed for that story. And then for every comment, we pulled down all the users who voted for those comments. And so now what we've got are the lists of people who vote on particular comments on a given story. And we decided to look at the registration times of the voters. And then the final part of this metric, if you're following me so far, is that we looked at the variation between the voter age of voters on comments on a given story. So essentially what we're trying to do here is to say, well, how similar are the users who vote on a given story, on the comments in a given story? And one proxy for that is, well, how similar are their creation ages? Hence the variance there. But you can do other things. You can try and compare their bios, their names, and all of that kind of stuff. But voter age is a reasonable one for this. And so we get this. Each of the points represents a story and the variance of voter age on a story. So this is across Al Jazeera. And you can see the variance is it's all over the place. And we thought we'd then focus, well, actually what we're trying to do is to say if profiles are similar, they're going to have low variance. So let's zoom in then on the bottom part of this, and we'll pick some of those points at random. And you can see there's a number of stories with very low variance. It could be noise, but it's interesting. They also had a minimum number of comments in them. So it wasn't like 2 users on a comment or voting on a story. And so we pulled the voters for those comments, and there were a few things that stood out, just at first glance. There were some patterns. So for one, mostly the accounts were registered within minutes of each other, but there were patterns within the usernames, the profile names, which are different, and also in the email addresses. We pull that data, and what we can see there is this is a list of the people who vote on comments within a given story. And just at first glance, that stuff starts to go, well, we're not seeing, they start to look fairly regular. But like, it's not exactly convincing. Like in my heart of hearts, I am expecting Hot Guy 69 to appear somewhere in that list because it's the internet. But that just with four names, that's not enough to convince us. So we decided to keep going. Email addresses are an interesting aspect for Discuss. They're not a requirement, but you have to supply one at sign up, but they don't have to be verified. So if we could get the email addresses for all of those profiles that we looked at, then there was a possibility that there might be patterns there. But Discuss doesn't give you the email address of a user. That's private information. So we went looking. We found an unmasked attack that lets you get the email address of a Discuss user. So now for given random Discuss user, you can troll them in their private mailbox if you wanted to. And we looked a little bit further and found the inverse. So given someone's email address of your friends or your family or whoever, you could map that back to their Discuss username. Both of those are reported and fixed, so that's no longer possible. But we used them for our work, and it let us pull out the email addresses for all the sock puppets. And they had this very regular pattern as well, first name, surname @gmail.com. Okay, so our suspicion is starting to grow. But the size of the number of puppets that we had found seemed smaller than we expected. Like it was 17, and we thought, well, if we were running a sock puppet army, we wouldn't just do it with 17. So we thought we'd try and enumerate. And like there's a bunch of text there, but the point here is that Discuss gives you, every user is assigned a user ID. It's just a counter. So we can take the user IDs of the users that we know about, the sock puppets that we know about. We just increase our search space a little bit on either side of those, and we're going to enumerate a bunch of users. For all the users that we download all their information for, which includes email addresses, we then apply the patterns that we already know about. and see which of them match that pattern. So we pulled info for 5,000 users. We applied those filters. And what we got was actually quite a nicely filtered list of users. And they do start to look very regular. Like, what's the pattern that jumps out? Does anyone want to take a stab? So if you look at that list, it's ordered, right? So the list looks like it's ordered. And it looks like it's ordered by email address, but it's not. It's ordered by time, registration time. And it's quite striking that it's ordered by registration time, but the names are alphabetical. The email addresses are alphabetically ordered. So like, that really does suggest to us that, not even suggest to us, like, that starts to become pretty clear that someone's got names.txt and is pulling stuff out of names.txt. But just to convince you a little bit more, this graph, or this scatter plot, is showing you the delay between registration times of these bots. So sock puppet gets registered. How long is it before the next one in the list is registered? And again, you can see it's very tightly constrained. And effectively, it sits around a sleep 5 seconds in someone's script. So create bot, sleep 5, create the next one. And so that's the majority of them. The ones at the top right were also quite interesting for us. It's a bit of a sidebar, but effectively, we had missed at that point one of the registration events in the middle. So we sort of thought there were 10 seconds between those registration events, but actually there was one at 5 seconds in the middle that our filter at that point hadn't picked up. So we've got a bunch of attributes that we can filter these accounts on. And Discuss lets us, well, we can go a little bit further, because Discuss then says, well, given usernames, you can find out where they're active on. And this is where the Puppet army stuff starts to become quite active. So for every user in that sock Puppet army, we pull down all the comments they made, and we then graphed it. And this time, the graph makes a little bit more sense. In total, they'd posted about 7,500 comments, or about 7,000 comments, rather, of which 5,500 were posted to CNN. So really active on CNN. The next one was they were active on Al Jazeera, with about 1,000 comments. And then the next one, the next biggest one, was 200 comments. So you can see this sock puppet army is really, really active in only 2 major places, and clearly are quite active. The other thing that we find quite interesting is this row along the bottom of profiles that are they match all the filters, but they've never been used. And so we can only guess at that point. Either they're being held in reserve, or they lost access to them because they were just a cookie and the cookie got lost or got logged out, or whatever the case is. But it's sort of the coordinated action along the ones that were actually in use is, for us, quite interesting. OK. So as I said, we can pull out the comments made by the users. And Discuss had another bug at the time, which said that if you marked your profile as private, you could still pull down the comments for the private profiles. So actually, private profiles meant nothing. So yeah, they had a few issues, as you can see. But what we did was we pulled down all the user comments. And again, it starts to become quite interesting. So here's 6 different users all posting the same comment. So this notion of duplicates exists within at least the Puppet army that we saw, but it's less than you expect. So of the 7,000 odd comments that they posted, the duplicates were in the order of 1,000, 1,500. There were lots of unique comments. There was a lot of effort that went behind this Puppet army. It wasn't, and the comments to our eye appeared to be reasonably written. They didn't look like they were the result of a text generator. So it seemed like someone was putting a lot of effort into it. This graph is also, it's just kind of messy, but it shows the links between users and comments, and it's trying to give you an idea of duplicate comments, but there were a lot of them. Okay, so we've got that filter. We can see that these guys are active on the same places, and like at this point, we're pretty convinced. So this is sort of the results of that particular bot army, or sock puppet army. So 186 of them, they were active at the time when we did the work. They were active. They had been active for 4 months. 7,000 comments, of which 1.5 were duplicates. So a coming back to our picture of that CNN page, and this is actually one of the stories that we looked at. You remember we flipped it on the side. That's where the dividing line is. And all of that is bot activity, sock puppet activity. So this is the default. Comment load. This is not a strange order or anything. And like one analogy for this is, well, if you control that much comment and someone randomly scrolls down, they're likely to land into one of your comments, right? That's the NOP sled for sock puppetry, is you just pile them in there and someone will see something that you want them to see. Like one of the other stats for that is of all the top level comments, only 4% were not sock puppet comments on that story. So CNN's comments are pretty owned. And not by us, by someone else. So the question then becomes, well, what are they saying? What are they trying to push? I didn't skip that intentionally. There's a few things that come out, and it's quite interesting. The one is that the views are consistent. So we didn't find instances of the puppets disagreeing with each other. And what that suggests to us is that they really are trying to promote a message rather than just cause havoc. The views are also multifaceted. So it's not a single viewpoint which is trying to be pushed. So for example, while they are pro-Palestine and anti-ISIS, they're also anti-Obama, right? And so being anti-ISIS is not necessarily congruent with always being anti-Obama, or vice versa. So there are multifaceted views that this group is trying to push. And so then the inevitable question is, who is this? And this is where we absolutely pull away and say, no idea. Like anything in this field is pure speculation. Like attribution is hard just when it comes to network activity. When it comes to what people are actually writing, that's a problem that we, in truth, don't even know how to solve at this point. So there's a few ways out of this. We could shut down the puppet army, right? So lots of their email addresses weren't even registered, so you could register the mail address behind the puppet and then gain access to it. But that seemed like a lot of work. The one thought that comes out is that Discuss should start limiting their API and limiting the information that they publish in their API. But we think this is a bad idea. You'll notice that we found this thing on the site or on the service that provides us with the most information. Reddit does not provide you with information, and so you cannot locate sock puppet armies easily on Reddit. And there's a bunch of examples for that. Discuss gives you access to the data, and that lets us, who don't work there at all and who are doing this in our own time, we can find the puppet armies. So for us, that thing is important. But the news sites are taking a different approach. They're just phasing out comments. So CNN last year phased out comments. Jazeera's phased out comments. There's a bunch of sites. Reuters is moving away from it. Recode and a few others. So they are not seeing the value in having user comments because of the influx of that.
So let's just quickly summarize. Now that we've come a full circle from making our own sock puppet army and finding others that take the same shortcuts and worse that we do. So without exception, many of the sites we looked at have just proven absolutely trivial to manipulate. We think it's very worth pointing out because it's important, A, to be aware of it so that we can begin to build tools to help deal with it. But just on that last point, before we begin building tools to help deal with it, it's worth noting, as Marco pointed out as well, that having that data available at hand helps greatly when trying to figure out if anything suspicious is going on. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I will think I take one question just to offer the opportunity.
I'm the lucky one. Okay. Just a question. How did you do your test, or how did you perform it? Did you inform the people? Was it a black box test, or was it? Did you choose your victims, or how did you do that?
Yeah. So the test was informed by how would we do it? Like if we're trying to influence this stuff, what are the sites that we would do? Like in this field, and it's a bit of a cop-out, but in this field, like if you tell people that you're going to do the test, then like you're pre-informing them. So we didn't store, at least on the mailing list and the other ones, we didn't store, like we weren't keeping track of particular users and their clicks. For Discuss, we informed them, and they were okay with it. In fact, we're interested in the work. But no, in terms of how we did it, we didn't start by approaching customers or companies and requesting. Like, yeah, we just did it.
Okay, so Marco, Azhar, thank you very much. Very interesting.